Welcome, everyone, to the fourth of 5 gatherings that we're sponsoring, celebrating the 40th anniversary of the founding of the Upper Valley Haven. I'm Michael Redmond, the current executive director of the Haven. On behalf of the employees, volunteers, and board of directors, thank you for attending today. Today's featured speaker is Matt Slaughter. His topic is, what has happened to the well-being of American families over the past 40 years? More in a bit about Matt. First, some housekeeping. Our session is being recorded, so folks who are unable to attend today can watch at a more convenient time. Due to the size of our audience, as you've noticed, we're using the Zoom webinar format. Everyone has automatically been placed on mute. Matt welcomes questions and has provided time at the end of his talk to respond. Or if you have a question regarding one of his slides or want to add a point for discussion, please use the chat or the Q&A and sections on Zoom, and we'll get to as many comments and questions as we can. I'll be monitoring that. As mentioned, we're here today to celebrate the founding of the Upper Valley Haven, its work and role in the community over the past 40 years. On December 8th, 1980, 41 years to the day, the Upper Valley Haven's board of directors signed an articles of incorporation to form a new nonprofit organization. The group included leadership and members of local churches who had been meeting informally since September of that year in pursuit of a common goal: provide temporary shelter in the Upper Valley to those who were in need. By December, they were ready to make it official, and according to minutes from one of their early meetings, quote, put their faith to work for an emergency shelter. The Haven opened its doors to the first guests almost exactly a year after incorporating, December 15th, 1981. Fittingly, for an ecumenical organization, the Haven's first live-in host couple, Donna and Corty Church, welcomed a family of 7 whose last name was Bishop. Since those early days, the Haven has grown in the number of staff, the breadth and scope of its services, the number of buildings on our campus on Hartford Avenue, and the esteem in which it is held by the Upper Valley community. While these and many other changes have occurred, what has remained consistent is our mission that can be simply stated: no one should be hungry, everyone should have a home. This story about the founding of the Haven was recounted in the first of 40 stories of the Haven that we have been sharing since the beginning of this year about the people, events, ideas, and services fundamental to our mission. 37 so far and 3 to go. We'll place a link to the series that can be found on our website in the chat. Turning to our featured speaker, Matthew J. Slaughter, is the Paul Danos Dean of the Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth, where in addition, he is the Earl C. Daum 1924 Professor of International Business. He is also a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations, a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, a member of the Academic Advisory Board of the International Tax Policy Forum, and an academic advisor to the McKinsey Global Institute. Matt is also a longtime friend of the Haven. Thank you, Matt, for agreeing to be a speaker in our series, and welcome.
Hey, Michael, thank you for that kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm just so honored to help celebrate the 40th anniversary of the Haven. The Haven has been near and dear to my heart and the heart of my family, like so many of us in the Upper Valley and beyond over the years. So I really appreciate what you and colleagues continue to do. And I think what I was hoping we would do in this time together is actually have a conversation. So I put together a handful of slides to talk about, as Michael and I talked, thinking about over the arc of the Haven's time, people can see this, what has happened to the well-being of families in America over the past 40 years. And I'm an economist by training. And so I thought we would approach this by thinking about kind of looking at what the data show about how American families have been doing that over that time, and putting it into the context of the American dream and however you might define that. So I thought I'd walk us through some slides. We'll definitely have time after about a half hour when we can just open up to general Q&A. But as Michael said, I welcome if people have questions along the way, please throw them in the chat or in the Q&A function, and I'll keep an eye on that as well, along with Michael. If you have questions about the data that I'm showing, or interpretation or anything. And these slides, by all means, people can have if they would like afterwards. So with that, again, I think it would help to think about how American families have been doing along different economic dimensions. Not that the economy is the be all and end all, but I think the spiritual and material well-being for people has just a lot to do with their economic standing in terms of work, in terms of income, in terms of wealth, and in terms of opportunities that they see for themselves and their communities. So what I thought we would do is just walk through some data to think about how you define the American dream, what that might mean to you, and do you think that's been fading or reviving during the time that the Haven has been, excuse me, with us in the Upper Valley? And if it's been fading, kind of why that seems to be and what we might do about it. So those are three really broad questions that touch upon a lot of issues about America in terms of our society and policy making. I'll just say, as the note says here, I'm an independent economist, Tigger. I said I'm an economist. I'm a lifetime independent. So we can think about policy solutions, whether you self-identify as a Republican or a Democrat or independent or something else. And invoking the always useful Winnie the Pooh characters, I tend to be a very optimistic person by disposition. And I say that acknowledging that I think a lot of the data that we're going to walk through about how the typical American family has been doing over the past 40 years isn't exactly all that Tiggerish. But I firmly believe, like we teach here at the Tuck School, wise, decisive leadership needs to start from empirical evidence and data. So I'll just walk us through some data, again, organized around this theme of the American dream and understanding how families have been doing. But as I said, please, if you have questions or comments along the way, throw them in the chat or in the Q&A, and we'll have ample time towards the end for a general conversation with questions. So with that, let's just start with a little data before we get to your definition. So this is a chart that shows for every year as far back as this data series by the US government exists, back to 1984, what's called real median household income in America. So from 1984 through 2020. So just to level set a little bit on definitions, real means adjusted for price inflation. What really matters for the material well-being of American households is not the amount of money that they get paid in nominal terms, but the purchasing power that commands over buying goods and services or saving and doing other things with financially. So all the data here are adjusted as that vertical axis shows in terms of 2020 dollars, in terms of the year 2020. So earlier data are readjusted, the nominal dollars, to be converted to the year 2020 dollars using the consumer price index. Median household, we can line up households in America by their income from the most needy families that might exist in the Northeast Kingdom or rural Appalachia, all the way to someone like Warren Buffett or Bill Gates. And the median statistically means identify that household as you line up all of the there's about 130 million households in the United States today in our population of about 335 million. So if you lined up all those 130 million households, the median is the one that's at the 50th percentile, the one in the middle, quite literally, if you went from the most needy, lowest income family to the highest income family. And so this is tracking median household income in the entire United States as far back as this data series, as I said, exists, back to 1984. So what do we see? Well, geez, you can see a few things. Those gray bars are what economists call recessions. You see that definitely during and sometimes before recessions in the early 90s, the 2000s, the world financial crisis here, you tend to see median income falling. And it kind of goes up and down. I think in general, since the time that the Haven has existed, the median household in terms of their inflation adjusted income has been rising from about $54,000 up to about $65,000, $67,000, right as the pandemic was taking hold. Last year's data, a little titchier because the survey, these data come from a survey of American households, so it's not sampling everyone. But there's always a set of statistical issues around measurement when you do these surveys. I tend to think, and my talk's going to focus a little bit more on thinking about the tale of two generations here. There was a period from the early 1980s to about the year 2000, where there was definitely the downturn in the early 90s around the recession. That was felt a lot in New England, I know. But there was pretty steady growth in median household income. But this first generation of the 21st century has actually been quite different. It's a period of time where over much of this past generation, there was declining and then some recovery in median household income. But over this period overall, the percentage growth, as I'll walk us through, has been much, much slower in median household income than it was in earlier times. And when you think about a household, what goes into this total income that's being reported here is a few things. It depends on how big the households are. and whether you've got young adults or parents that are in the labor force, how much time they might be working in the labor force, whether working part-time or full-time, and what's the earnings that they're realizing by the hour or in total for a given year. And this figure here also incorporates transfers that the federal government makes to households. Income supports like Social Security, for example, is one of the measures that comes into this aggregate measure of median household income. So here we are for the United States overall. And as I said, I think in thinking about the American dream in the more recent times that the Haven's been such an important and vital member of our community, I want to focus a little bit on the period since around the turn of the century, around 1999, 2000. That's for America overall. Let's just take a quick look at Vermont and New Hampshire separately. You can get these data by state. So the next slide, the next slide. Oh, I went to the Fred data. I apologize for that. I double clicked. Let me stop screen sharing to make sure everybody sees what I want. If you're interested, this data series called Fred comes from the Federal Reserve Board, the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. And it's a wonderful data resource for anybody who wants to go and look at some data. So let me just make sure that I'm sharing here again. And I think I am. So this is data from Vermont. It's a lot choppier in part because you've just got fewer households in the sample. So what I want to see here for Vermont is it kind of looks like the United States overall. There was some growth in the last generation of the 20th century, and then a bit choppier performance in this first generation of the 21st century. But in levels, median household income in Vermont is about what it is in the United States overall. And if I click on the next slide, here's for New Hampshire. One thing I want you to see is on average, incomes are a bit higher in New Hampshire than they are in Vermont. That has a lot to do with the Boston metropolitan area. So if you're sampling households in New Hampshire, the growth of the Boston metropolitan area, which economically definitely spills over into southern New Hampshire, there's a lot of higher income households and jobs in southern New Hampshire that have been building over the past handful of decades as Boston has grown so much as a real economic center and a lot of innovation there. But again, same kind of choppiness a little bit that you see for Vermont, but on average, incomes in New Hampshire are a bit higher than they are in Vermont. But a lot of variation across our communities. That's something that we could talk about a little bit more if people like. Let me go forward now and let's just think about these questions of how you might define the American dream. So think about how you might define that to yourself or how you've done it over the years. And I'm going to walk us through, I think it's 5 different ways or dimensions that might matter for what you think is the American dream thriving and what that means for households are doing. And we'll take a little bit closer look at some data related to each of these possible definitions. So let's start with, I think a lot of people think about income, as we've been talking about, in particular the labor market earnings. So we can think about the American dream perhaps as the notion that the earnings of workers and of families overall have been rising over time. I think a lot of us like the idea that if people are engaged in work, that the dignity that comes with that work is reflected in the earnings that people have, and that over time, those earnings would be rising. So one of the ways I think the data is a little sobering, and perhaps not the most vigorous of data, is when you look, especially in this first generation of the 21st century, what you see to invoke the metaphor that John Kennedy used when he was president of the United States in some lovely speeches he gave, that the rising tide hasn't been lifting a lot of boats in terms of earnings. So President Kennedy spoke about the rising tide ideally lifting all the boats. Think of the rising tide as growth in output in the total US economy. What economists tend to look at a number you may get here from time to time called GDP, gross domestic product, the value of all the outputs of goods and services. That's the rising tide. And then I think a lot of us, one dimension of the American dream is the idea that a lot of the boats, a lot of the workers that are providing a lot of the critical labor services for that output, their earnings are rising over time. Maybe not by the exact same level or percentage across the different skills for workers, but I think a lot of us would imagine and have thought of the American dream as a lot of workers having their earnings rising over time. That hasn't been happening in the first part of the 20th century nearly as widely as it was in earlier decades in the United States. So let me just walk us through these data. Again, we're going to look at inflation adjusted, so real. This is now total money earnings for workers, not looking at families, but for individual workers, and marching up the skills ladder of educational attainment. As we all know, educational attainment is an imperfect measure of the labor market skills that individuals bring to their work. You think of Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg and some famous entrepreneurs. They're all college dropouts. They've done quite well in the labor market. And of course, one's educational attainment has nothing to do with the inherent dignity and worth that all of us humans bring to the planet. And yet, in terms of understanding the labor market skills or the human capital, as economists talk about it often, this is the single best summary measure of one's human capital. And it's one for which the underlying survey we looked at a minute ago of households, there's a companion survey that the US government does each year, asking individuals about their labor market earnings and tracking that by their skills in terms of educational attainment. So let's march up the skills ladder. From 2000 through 2016, I wanted to catch these data in part because it takes a few years oftentimes for the government to finalize these data for different educational samples. So let's start with people who have a high school degree or less. In 2016, that was still 37.6% of all the workers in the American labor force. And over that time, the average or mean change for all workers with a high school degree or less was a slight decline over those 16 years of 0.7%. So that's a boat, if we stick with that metaphor, whose average earnings wasn't rising. And we can think about all the complex supply and demand reasons that might be happening, but let's just take this as data. Let me march up the skills ladder and I'll peek at the chat real quick. People with some college, 27% of workers, this is with or without a 2-year associate degree, but not a bachelor's degree or above. Over this period since 2000, the earnings change was a decline on average of 7.2%. So now if you quick with your maths and you're telling the middle column, you see that we're not quite at, but almost 2/3 of workers in the American labor force, all of whom over this generation, their inflation-adjusted earnings on average had been rising, not falling. Now, clearly within this average doesn't capture, some individuals were doing very well, some were growing a little bit, some earnings were falling by much more than this average. But on average, what we see is the majority of the American labor force in this first part of the 20th century, measured by educational attainment, their average earnings were flat to falling during this period. Now, over much of the 20th century, hard work and good luck, you earned at least a college degree. Your real earnings were rising over almost all time periods over the 20th century. Part of what's been a little bracing in this first part of the 21st century, that hasn't even been happening. So let's look at people with a 4-year college degree, not an advanced degree, but a 4-year college degree. 22% of workers, and the mean earnings change over this period was a decline, again, not a rise, a decline of 4.3%. So who's left in the labor force at this point? Well, it's people with master's or other advanced degrees of some kind. Let's look at non-professional master's degrees, master's in social work, master's in public policy. That's about 10% of workers, 9.9%. Over this 16-year period, a decline in average earnings for this group of 5.5%. So at this point, you might say, well, who's left in the labor force? It's the advanced professional degrees of the doctors and the lawyers and the MBAs. That's about 1.5% of workers, a slight earnings increase there on average, and also people who earn a Ph.D. 2% of workers, a mean earnings increase of 4.3%. If I go back to households and look at household income over this time period, just to kind of show us a little bit more what we saw in the figure, go all the way to 2020. Median household income in 2020 was $67,521 in the United States. That was only about 6.5% above what it was way back to its previous peak in 1999. That's a bit of an increase, but only about 1/3% a year, or in actual dollars of about $195 a year. So part of what's been challenging economically, and this clearly a lot of research shows feeds into a lot of the legitimate anxiety people feel, a lot of the fractiousness in American politics, is that very few incomes have been rising strongly in inflation-adjusted terms for workers in this first part of the 20th century. Now, in the past few years before and coming out of the pandemic, the labor market was much tighter. I'll come back to that a little bit later. But that was a few years relative to close to a generation of pretty poor earnings growth for the large majority of Americans. So with that, let's just move on to another possible definition that people have. And thanks, John. I see in the Q&A that you posted a definition of the American dream in terms of access to basics. So I like that. And I'll connect that with the numbers we were just looking at. If in inflation-adjusted terms, I think those are very meaningful because that gives you a sense of, through time, adjusting for the price of access to food and clothing and shelter, what's the purchasing power that households have that come from their income. So another way a lot of people think about the American dream is not the annual flows of income from work, but over time, if they save, how that savings might grow in terms of building what economists call the wealth of households. So we might think the American dream has something to do with the wealth of workers and of families rising over time. Let's look at the data on this. And again, here, what we see is that in this first part of the 20th century, there have not been a lot of boats rising in terms of growing wealth for households. So again, I'm going to give us a chart that looks at data. These are the two most kind of data-intensive slides. Every 3 years, the Federal Reserve Board, the Fed, our central bank, conducts an in-depth survey of households to ask them about what assets they may own, things like stocks and bonds, their checking accounts, their saving accounts, motor vehicles, homes. They also ask them about what liabilities they may have, what outstanding debt they may have, debt on mortgage interest that they're still making payments on for their house. It might be loans for credit cards. It might be loans for vehicles. It might be educational loans. And for some of the moderate and lower income households, that picks up things like title loans or payday loans. So what I want to show us here is the mean net worth for US households, again, sort of marching up the distribution, where what the Fed puts in the public domain is households broken into 4 quintiles, meaning 25%, 25%, 25% of all the households. So each quintile has, in the United States, a little over 30 million households. So these are inflation adjusted. The last survey was done in 2019. It's every 3 years, so go back 18 years and you get to 2001. Let's start with the bottom quintile of households, less than 25%. These numbers, the way to read them is in 2001, the mean net worth of the bottom 25% of households in terms of net worth in the United States was $100, 1/10 of 1,000, so $100. By 2019, that mean net worth had actually fallen, not risen, to slightly negative $13,600. So in wealth terms, here's a set of households, and I think on average, these are more likely to be a number of the Havens clients whose net worth today is lower than it was in inflation adjusted terms a generation ago. Let's keep going. Let's look at the next quintile, the 25th to 50th percentile. Again, here what we see is a decline in the average net worth over this generation. It was $64,200 in 2001. That had declined slightly to $58,200 by 2019. If we keep going, let's go to the third quintile, 50th to 75th percentile. Again, perhaps surprisingly and a little bit soberingly, what we see is a slight decline in the mean net worth from $241,800 to $236,300. It is not until you go much higher in the distribution, 75th to the 90th percentile, and then that last 10th, actually, they break out the top decile, the 90th to the 100th percentile, that we see increases in mean net worth. And especially at the high end, what you start to see is the really striking skewness of the wealth distribution in the United States. Mean net worth rising from a little under $4 million in 2001 to $5.7 million in 2019. Again, go look at the median household. In 2019, the median household's net worth was $121,800. That was slightly less by about 2.8% where it was in 2007. It was actually close to 20%, 18.5% below where it was in the peak, which was right before the downturn in housing prices in the United States. So for the median household in America, the single biggest asset that they have in their balance sheet is what equity they may have in their home that they own. Not quite, but it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 2/3 of US households own the home that they live in. Household ownership rates have fallen a bit in recent years, back down to closer to 60%, but go back a number of decades, and not quite, but close to 2/3 of Americans, the home that they live in, they actually own. So the second broad measure of well-being of households, again, if you think about wealth of households, a little bit like income, what's a bit bracing is the median household over the past generation. At best, they're kind of, I think, holding their own in terms of their net worth. It's slightly down a little bit, as these numbers actually show here. So when we think about the American dream, and we think about households are doing on these important measures of their labor market earnings, the wealth that they might be accumulating, this first part of the 20th century has been very different from earlier generations and decades in a way that, again, I think speaks to some of the anxiety that we see in the Upper Valley and far beyond in our country. Let's think about a few other measures. Sometimes people think about the American dream, not just in terms of themselves, but in terms of the kids, if they have children, and more generally the children, the generation coming behind all of us that are getting a little older. So I think a lot of times people think about the American dream in terms of, well, are our children better off economically than our parents? That's a very difficult question to answer with precision in terms of the kind of the way that scholars like to think about having an adequate data. But there's some remarkable work that's been done by a team of scholars headed up by a gentleman named Raj Chetty at Harvard in recent years. It's called the Opportunity Project. And what they've done is they've linked together tax returns, the personal tax returns that we all file to the IRS every year across decades and decades, where you can link together children and parents based on the reporting of Social Security numbers. So as a lot of us know, when you have children and you're filling out your annual tax returns, your 1040 or whatever version of it, you report your children as dependents and your and their Social Security numbers are on there. So what Raj Chetty and a team of scholars did over many years was reached out to the federal government and undertook a very painstaking set of work to link together in all the archives of the US government data of annual year-by-year tax returns, link together children with their parents. And that allows them to ask and answer some basic questions like this one in terms of, say, income. Because as we know, in our tax returns, we report our total income as a household or individuals to the government. So they put together this striking chart that gives a sense of, answers the basic question of when children in America have been growing up, when they get to young adulthood, are they earning more or less than their parents? So what this chart shows, and they literally went and looked at every single child born in the United States. You can pick whatever your birth year is, from 1940 all the way through to 1984 in this chart. They have one more year now they put on the web. So I was born in 1969, for example. So here's my birth cohort. And what they did then was track these individuals as they aged through time, looked at them at age 30, looked at their income reported to the IRS when they were age 30, and compared it to the income of their parents when they were born. Now, within this, there's a lot of measurement issues you need to think about. Again, you need to adjust for price inflation, like we were looking at in earlier charts. You also need to account for the fact of sometimes when children are born, they may have one or both parents or caregivers working. So they need to account for coming up with some measure of average parents' earnings. And if you're interested, you can go to their website and read all about the work that they did. But very simply, what they calculated was each year of all the children born that year, they looked out then 30 years hence and asked what fraction, what percent, 0 to 100% of those children when they reached 30 were earning more than their parents were. So this circle, this dot right here that I'm circling of 92, that's 92% of the children born in the United States in 1940. By the time they reached age 30, they were earning more than their parents were. And I think a lot of us kind of like the idea that a lot of our children, as they mature into young adulthood, the economic opportunities presented to them in the labor market are such that they can earn more than we did. I think that's a lot of the aspiration we have for our children. What we see here, however, is that children are decreasingly likely to earn more than their parents in the United States. So these rates of what they call absolute mobility, what fraction of children, once they reach young adulthood, were earning more than their parents, what we see here is this pretty ongoing decline in the percentage of children born in America who ended up earning more than their parents. By the time that this chart was made, when they put these data out for the first time a couple of years ago, the birth cohort of children born in 1984, only about 50% of them, only about half, were earning more than their parents by the time they reached young adulthood, a decline from this 92%. So again, to the extent that I think a lot of us like the idea that we're in a society and a country where children economically are progressing and having more success, not necessarily that, again, the dollars and cents is what matters, but for human well-being in terms of their ability to provide food and shelter for themselves and their loved ones. This likelihood of children doing better than their parents on this basic measure has actually been declining, not rising. Let's think about a couple other measures of well-being that we oftentimes comes up in people's minds. We talked about individuals or talked about families in terms of children. A lot of us, per the great work that the Haven does, just think about a community. So it's a question of whether communities are coming together economically over time. This requires you to actually change your lens and not look at individuals or look at kids and parents through time, but to have some measure of communities. Now, this gets very hard to do statistically because, as we know, as lovely as the Upper Valley is, there's not a lot of us here relative to large metropolitan areas. So measurement gets a bit trickier for smaller communities. So a lot of the academic work that's been done on this looks at larger metropolitan areas in the United States. So this next chart I'm going to show us is based on some research that I and a co-author did, looking at the roughly 55 metropolitan areas in the United States that in recent years have at least 1 million people in them. Over much of the 20th century within the United States and in other countries, what we saw was, if you measure geographic communities by states or by metropolitan areas, on a lot of measures like average income, like we've been looking at, over time, communities, be they states or metropolitan areas, the differences economically were shrinking over much of the 20th century. But what's been happening in the past 20, 30, 40 years, depending on the measure that you look at, that's actually is reversing. So what is happening is that people, the talented people in terms of labor market measures like educational attainment, rather than being spread out more evenly across the country, they're actually concentrating more and more in the metropolitan areas that already had a lot of the high talent individuals. So what this little scatter chart here shows is for these roughly 50 metropolitan areas, metropolitan statistical areas, MSAs, what Ken, my co-author, and I measured here was the share of the population in these MSAs that had a college degree or higher in the year 1980. This outlier here is actually, this is Washington, D.C., but we focused on some whose names we highlighted here. What was the change over the next 36 years that we had data for in terms of the fraction of that population that was college educated? Over much of the 20th century, when you made scatter plots like these, this scatter plot was sloped down in this figure, meaning the initially highly educated, high talent, high economic performance communities, they had slower growth in high talent individuals over subsequent decades. But as this chart shows, over the past couple of generations, roughly the time that the Haven has been with us in the Upper Valley, this is actually reversing. And economic activity and income growth has become more and more concentrated in large cities like Seattle, Washington, D.C. Other ones here are San Francisco, San Jose, Boston. There's some deep changes both in the United States, and you actually see this in the other countries for which we can see data as well, where our communities are actually becoming more unequal, a bit like income across people or wealth across people and families is becoming more unequal. The same underlying economic forces of globalization and technological change, though they are immensely beneficial to the United States overall in the aggregate, how that's distributed has actually changed quite a lot. And that's just kind of one of the deep issues that policymakers in states and communities in Washington, D.C. are grappling with. I see a question, John, thank you, about what happened to allow that upward mobility trend to stabilize that we looked at a minute ago. Great question. Short answer, we don't really know. Some of that work by Roz Chetty and co-authors is so new and so revolutionary in terms of the sophistication with which they've been able to link together families across decades using the tax return data. Some of their ongoing work is trying to understand what might explain the faster or slower declines in mobility that we've seen there. So thanks for that question. I think I've got one more data chart to show us, and it's related to a fifth and final dimension of the American dream that a lot of us care a lot about, and that's actually thinking about issues of race. My goodness, with issues of Black Lives Matter in the wake of the George Floyd murder in the past couple of years in the United States, there's rightly, I think, been a heightened awareness of how our country's doing economically and socially when we think about divisions of race. And so we have US government data that, like what we've been looking at on income and wealth, where individuals or families are self-identified by the four main racial and ethnic categories that the US government's been tracking over many decades: people who self-identify as white, people who self-identify as Black, Hispanic, and Asian. Those are the four main categories over many years that the US government has looked at, for which some of the academic research then has tried to track economic well-being. And I think a lot of us envision the American dream as racial gaps that have been tragically with our country for centuries, that those things are closing over time, and that people's economic well-being is less and less tied to the history and legacy of systemic racism. But last data chart I'll show us on this kind of overview, again, what we see is that if anything, in recent decades, basic measures of racial disparity, such as the average earnings gap between workers who self-identify as Black versus white, if anything, this has been slightly widening in recent decades rather than declining. So this is a chart from a story that ran in the New York Times. Kerwin Charles is a terrific economist and actually my peer dean at the Yale School of Management, and his co-author, Patrick Bayer. This is a summary of analysis they did where they looked at, for Black men, average earnings, total annual earnings for Black men and who are all in the labor force or those that were employed full time. And their message here was, boy, there was growth and a closing of some of the black-white earnings gap in the middle part of the last century. But you get to around 1970, 1980, and the closing of that gap stopped. And if anything, on some measures, it's widened back a little bit. And what we see when you look at other similar measures, such as net worth, and I've got some language on the bottom here, what we see is large and persistent gaps in wealth, like in income in the United States across racial lines. So in 2019, the most recent year of data for household income we looked at, median net worth of white households, white-headed households, about $188,000. That was almost 8 times, 7.8 times the median net worth of black-headed households that year, which was only $24,100. So again, I'm a tigger by disposition, but I think the summary from these numbers that I've walked us through is that during the time the Haven has been with us, and especially if you look at the first generation here of the 21st century, on a lot of common definitions of the American dream that focus on economic measures, we could see. At best, the American dream is not exactly surging and reviving in a way that I think a lot of us would like. And in some ways, it's actually been fading, which of course begs the couple of questions that I'll put to us and we can open for the conversation in a couple of minutes, which is, well, what's causing that? And what could we do about that? But one thing I'll add is, I think if people want to talk about the pandemic and a lot of the public policy support, I think a lot of the fiscal support that our federal government has provided to families during the pandemic has had a material and appropriate effect, but it's modest relative to these trends that we're talking about. And a lot of the ongoing scholarship in real time, people are realizing the magnitude of that support is going to be fading, given that some of these programs, such as extended unemployment insurance benefits, child tax credits, it's unclear whether those are going to persist. So this is a chart that actually I cut and pasted in this morning from today's New York Times, and I won't go through it in detail, but if you're subscribed to the Times, you can go look at it. Some very good work done by the JP Morgan. They have an institute in their bank where they can see the checking accounts of, I think it's well north of like 1 million of their customers in the country. And what this chart shows is they took a look at the median checking account balance. Again, households broken out by 4 quartiles based on their income that JP Morgan sees, that they report. And what you can see is that relative to this same week in late September before the pandemic hit, everybody's mean checking account balance has risen. That's partly because of the rebound in the labor market for some. It's partly because of the fiscal transfers. But I think a lot of us would agree the magnitudes aren't all that massive. So if you look at the bottom quartile of American households, boy, there's an increase of over 1/3, which in percentage terms sounds large, but in absolute terms, it's been an increase of only $393. That helps, but when we think about the fragility of a lot of households in the Upper Valley, and ones that the Haven supports in different ways, I think we can see the magnitude of challenges and pressures on the American dream that have been building for a number of years. In some ways, the pandemic has aggravated them. In some ways, the policy responses have been offsetting that, which I think has been appropriate and helpful. But the magnitude, I think some of the challenges our country faces are still going to be with us as we make our way out of the pandemic. Why is the American dream fading? It kind of gets to the question John asked earlier. There literally have been thousands of academic studies by economists like me and political scientists and sociologists and other scholars to understand different dimensions of this. If I summarize it in words in one slide, I would say this is the most accurate summary of all this important research, which is the American dream has been fading economically because of the interplay between 2 things. One is, as a country, we're not doing enough to build talent, to build the human capital, especially for our young. And that interacts with, as I've alluded to a couple of times, in recent decades, the returns to very talented individuals in the labor market has been very skewed. There's been a dramatic growth in earnings for extremely talented, high human capital people. That's sort of what the global economy is delivering, but that feeds into some of the data that we've been looking at. And my one last chart that I'll show us on insufficient building of talent. As an educator, I'm drawn and struck by this chart, which tracks mean scores by young adults in America that is measured every 3 years by the OECD. That's an organization in France, of which the United States and about 50 other countries are members. And every 3 years, they conduct this assessment of students called the PISA. So it's an assessment of the math, reading, and science skills of students, different ages. It goes up to, I think, age 15 in all these member countries around the world. So this is a snapshot for the United States over the time period we've been looking at, roughly this first generation of the 20th century, of mean scores, the average, but also they break it out by the income percentile of the family. So in the survey, they get a bit of information for some of the students about their family incomes or the regional incomes of the communities they're in. And so what you see is whether you look at some of the more challenged families and communities, the average in America, or some of the better off communities and families, these lines are pretty flat. We're simply not building on this measure, which is reading capabilities, the human capital of our young, of our children, who are going to be the ones that are our future, both literally and metaphorically, for kind of how the country performs. So I will say, I think the evidence is quite clear. One of the challenges is, especially as the economy of the United States becomes more connected to the dynamism of the global economy, if our individual workers and our families and our communities, we're not building the human capital and the social capital that's necessary to build and create and sustain good jobs in the global economy, this is part of what's making it more challenging for the American dream. So how might we revive that? You know, we can talk about this in the Q&A. I'm happy to answer any questions people might have. I won't read this, but if you handed me what I sometimes call the magic wand for what I do, I've done some research on this with some co-authors, and I have a pretty strong point of view that what we need to do to sort of save globalization and revive the American dream is to build what my co-authors and I have called building a lifelong ladder of opportunity. We need to, at different key life stages, build more human capital and think about where the public sector, where there's high social returns beyond the private returns to building human capital. That, I think, would be the biggest thing that would help build more sense of a hope and an opportunity across our country. So that first rung, I think, should actually be early childhood education programs for every child from birth through kindergarten. The academic research confirms the massive social returns and private returns to society from very early childhood interventions. I know the Haven does some good work on this. Second would be to help people that finish high school but don't see a viable path to at least community college, to provide the income resources so they could actually get at least an associate's degree. The labor market returns to getting an associate's degree are quite high compared to just a high school degree, and again, a lot of social benefits. And for all the workers in America who don't have a 4-year degree or above, that's still 100 million people in the labor force. Ideally, every 10 years, the federal government would finance some sort of retraining for them through the companies they work with, through a tax credit for their employers. So not to get in the weeds, that's what I think we should do. This would be an important investment. This would cost about $250 billion a year in the United States. But if my magic wand were powerful enough, I think this would be something that would be a bold step to help revive the American dream in the United States. Of course, different people can and should have different opinions about what to do, but I just share this as food for thought in the conversation. Again, I'm happy to take any questions that people may have, and I just want to offer a huge thanks to Michael and everyone at the Haven for the really important work that they do for our community. As I said, I know so many of our families have been touched by the Haven, and it means a lot to everyone when our world maybe perhaps isn't as equitable and as building as much hope and opportunity as we would like. But the Haven clearly in our community is such a beacon of vital work for all that. So thank you again, Michael, and happy to take people's questions.
Great. Thank you, Matt. Wonderful presentation, very dense. And so a reminder, we will be sending out the slides. We'll be sending the recording of this video will be available so you can put it on 0.75 speed for listening back and try to capture all the nuance. The last question I will ask is for you to answer at the very end, why you remain a Tigger with all of this. I mean, I think there's every reason not to be, but you are. It also is, quite evident that some of the Build Back Better, legislation that is pending does include some of the recommendations that you have had, many of them, particularly at early childhood. Matt, you could look at in the chat where there are, if you can, or I can read, that there's a lot of questions that are there that you could pick off and answer. I'm going to ask one that's a little bit outside of economics, perhaps. It's more philosophical.
Yeah.
Do you believe that we'll call it either the story or the mythology of the American dream has negative results in how policymakers think about what needs to be done to allow it to occur?
Oof, great question. So I think I'm going to answer this way. I'm going to connect it, Michael, if I may, with a couple of the good questions I see in the chat and the Q&A. What has happened along with this kind of waning economic American dream in the way we've talked about is a lot of scholarship has showed there's really a decline in social trust. And so some of the work that I showed us here was with an old Ken Sheevey, an old college roommate with whom I wrote this foreign affairs essay. This project, we surveyed people in, we looked at 9 metropolitan areas, like I mentioned, and we conducted a lot of economic analysis, but we ran focus groups and surveys. And so generated scores of hours of conversations. And it was striking in these communities how you saw a decay in trust in a lot of the key leaders that we think of in our communities and in our broader nation. A decline in trust in local government officials in Washington, D.C., and oftentimes leaders of businesses and other organizations. So part of why I'm a Tigger, here, the first part of your question, Michael, was in some ways, the most optimistic of those 9 communities that we looked at was actually the Detroit metropolitan area, Detroit, Michigan. I think a lot of us, if you know what's happened to Detroit over the past generation, with the acute economic challenges for the automobile industry and what happened there, you'd be like, wow, really, Detroit? I mean, it's been, the economic cataclysm there has been dramatic. It has been, but when you look at the what people said in Detroit was things materially turned around when a new mayor came in. And I'm blanking on his name, Michael, not gonna think of his name, but the mayor who came in there, he came in after a number of years where mayors and a lot of appointed elected officials, there was a lot of graft and corruption. People were convicted and sent to jail. And he came in and said, he literally metaphorically, one of the first things he did was he said, our fire hydrants don't work, our lights don't work on the street corners, and that's demoralizing and it's part of the decay of trust. And we're gonna get these things to work again. So partnered with the fire department, they went around, their records were archaic, they had paper records and on broken fire hydrants that were never connected to their IT system. And kind of example by example, started to rebuild trust in the community. So it was remarkable when we looked at some of the summary measures of the sense of trust and optimism that Detroit was one of the communities that stood out as one of the most optimistic.
Is that Michael Duggan? Is that?
Yeah, thank you, Michael Duggan. Yeah, exactly. Thank you. And you know, he'd been a hospital executive in the metropolitan area, and I think just felt that sense of calling. And I think you know, we've had a lot of fractious and difficult times in our country's history over the 200 plus years, but time and again, there's individuals and entities in our communities that are able to, I think, coalesce a sense of trust and really change the direction. So that's kind of why I'm a Tigger. That's kind of what I heard is the main part of your question, Michael. And I don't know if it answers it completely. To some extent, it's better than the alternative, to be honest. We still have a lot of wealth and know-how compared to a lot of other sovereign nations. So I think it's just a matter of really listening more closely to each other and taking the small and large steps that will rebuild the trust.
Yeah. James writes, similar to your thought of the connection between the fading American dream and citizen trust in government and faith in democracy, thinks the two are closely related.
Yeah, they definitely are. And what's interesting is not just because I sit in a business school, but Edelman, there's a public relations firm called Edelman, and they do an annual trust barometer. So if you Google around, you can look at it. And what they found in the United States and in many other countries in the past couple of years, the dramatic decline in trust in, again, public officials, and at least in a relative term, in real terms, it's small business and large business owners. They're looking to kind of the private sector to provide some leadership on this. And so where trust can be rebuilt, we definitely need to rebuild the civic trust, but it's trust in neighbors, it's trust in businesses, it's trust in not-for-profits. So there's a lot of opportunity, I think, to make things better. So
that's with your labor economist colleagues think about that more labor is needed. We've seen the great resignation, the declining labor force participation rates. Anne asked a question about relying on immigrant talent at all levels or increasing immigration. And that does that also then connect with an earlier question about the divide between urban and rural wealth or building of incomes?
Yeah, great question. So thank you for that. I'd say a couple things. You know, I went and looked at the data this morning. I wrote it down here. There's a monthly survey called the JOLTS, Job Openings and Labor Turnover Survey, JOLTS. And it counts at the end of each month the number of job openings of all the businesses. So drive around the Upper Valley and just count. You can see all the signs on 12A and wherever you go. A survey that tries to extrapolate that to the whole US. On Halloween, last day in October, our government reported this morning, there were 11 million job openings. And at the same time, if you look at the monthly unemployment data, there were only that to Dartmouth and study here and gain employment in the US, all the way to the Emma Lazarus's, give us your huddled masses, immigrants who come from whatever they have, their talents and skills and dreams. They've long been contributors in the aggregate to the United States, and especially to a lot of the rural communities. We all know the labor scarcity and how a lot of agriculture establishments and tourism, it depends on, if you know the US immigration policy a little bit, the H-2B visas. So I've written some things. I'm a firm believer that ideally we would expand immigration policy to allow more immigrants to come into America, and in particular make it easier for migrants to settle in the rural communities and not just tend to agglomerate in the urban areas. So it'd be great. Again, the legislation we could write, we just need some bipartisan leadership in Washington, D.C. to make progress on stuff like that. So
thinking at the national level, tying a few things here, some ask about some policies like minimum wage, which hasn't, has been very flat and negatively in real terms over a long period of time. But in larger, stepping back a little higher level, from the mid 1970s, this the period of greater decline or inequality, to what degree do you tie that to federal policies that perhaps are work against the interest of those who are low income or with lower educations, or is it an international economic movement that that what happens in Washington is as important as overall world economic trends?
Yeah, great question, Michael. Again, it kind of comes, I see a couple of questions related to that. So it's on unionization, minimum wage. I'll give a narrow answer, which is I firmly believe we should increase the federal minimum wage and couple that with a permanent increase in what's called the earned income tax credit. Both those things will be incentives to have people join the labor force and gain skills in the labor force. So most economists like me, RSDs or independents like me would say the optimal policies, we want to increase the minimum wage, but also increase the earned income tax credit along with that. We haven't increased the federal minimum wage relative to inflation in decades, I believe. I'm not going to get the exact rate, but it's been at least 30 years, I believe. It's approaching 40. Most of the academic research shows it is sort of what I call the dynamic economic forces of, in particular, technological change, innovation that has tended to make skilled workers be more valued by companies, what economists call skill-biased technological change. I know it's a mouthful. Combined with some forces of globalization, like more international trade, especially as China acceded into the global economy in the past generation in a dramatic way. Those are the main forces that have been putting pressure on the earnings of a lot of households in America. And so the policy response to that is kind of hard to build walls to the rest of the world. In fact, I think most Americans, they actually don't want us to build walls to the rest of the world. They do not want us to isolate ourselves by cutting off and not having more immigrants come in, by not allowing us to trade with the rest of the world. People want these ladders of opportunity so that these bridges to the rest of the world and to dynamism is what could kind of push things forward. So there's a lot of state variation in terms of minimum wages, which is great. But again, it's one where I think the federal government is uniquely empowered to have an impact on some of these main ways that we could build opportunity through labor market capital for a lot of workers.
I think we all believe in, or like to believe in, efficient markets. We know there are market failures and or there's outcomes that we don't like. And you pointed out a few of those. So Richard asked a question about taxation on wealth, which has come up recently. Is there some sort of level of either for leveling or justice? Choose your reason. Should there? Do you believe that it would be helpful to American dream outcomes if there was higher levels of taxation on wealth or intergenerational transfers?
Yeah, great question. So again, I'll give you the policy magic wand answer. So wealth taxes are really hard. And the reason they're really hard is because a lot of the wealth, whether it's the bonds or stocks that some of you may own, or homes or art or just whatever the kind of assets that people own, they're extremely difficult to value. And so when you look around the world, and just they're volatile. So you might say, well, I can see the stock price today, but stock prices, they go up, they go down, they by the second. So you look at some other sovereign nations, some European countries that have implemented wealth taxes over the past 20, 30 years to try to either ameliorate inequality or just as a general source of tax revenue. And what you see is they're really, really hard to implement. So in theory, you might, you harken back to your college days of John Rawls' theory of justice or whatever philosophic framework you might have. In practice, wealth taxes are pretty difficult. So many countries have tried them. They don't raise a lot of revenue. They're really administratively difficult. So they tend to go away with them. So what Ken and I propose, for example, I believe that we should have more progressivity in our income tax. So the way that we proposed, for example, to pay for our lifelong ladder of opportunity in a fiscally neutral way to not increase the deficit was two things. Repealing the high-end tax cuts, the personal income tax cuts that were passed in 2017. The other thing we proposed was to eliminate, this is a little weedy, but the tax preferences given to employer-provided health insurance, because that tends to favor higher income, high wealth households. Now, if the policy wand were big enough, you mentioned things we don't like, Michael, as our planet warms, per the fact that, we got a little bit of snow today, but I looked at the weather, it's supposed to be like 50 by Saturday again. What our country really needs is a meaningful tax on carbon to offset the damages of rising temperatures on our planet from CO2 emissions. The United States and other countries desperately, very quickly need to have a meaningful tax on carbon emissions. And that would be part of what would help raise revenues in the United States to pay for some of the investments that we're talking about. And most economists would say you want to tax things that have these negative externalities that are bad. And the classic one, frankly, is pollution. So a bunch of ways we can think about financing some of the ways to build more of the American dream.
Thank you. There's a question that asked about using household data. To your knowledge, have there been changes in the number of wage earners within households that could be having an impact? I think the question was about two earners in households versus one. And what's any trends that are meaningful in that?
Yeah, great question. I saw a couple of I like the weedy questions about measurement. So households on average during the time we looked at have gotten slightly smaller. At the same time, there's more labor force attachment during those 40 years, especially for women. So the net effect in terms of kind of total labor hours provided by a household, there's these countervailing forces. So if one likes, you can kind of Google around. Some scholars try to, for example, measure, take the raw data and account for the slight decline in the size of households, because all else equal, that would make some of those numbers look a little bit better. I'll say that's why a lot of scholars like to look at individual workers as a measure of kind of earnings potential, because there's a lot of issues about how a household comes together, right, in terms of family formation or roommates and this sort of stuff. So great question about kind of measurement.
Yeah. Is there, there's some thinking that the thought that you need a college education is also part of that American dream, and you did show that at very, very high levels and some technical skills, it makes a difference, but that it hadn't made a difference for typical earner or typical degrees and even master's level degrees. Is there something that we need to change that I think is in Build Back Better as well, regarding job skills that are non-education focused, that are work focused? And is there differences in the European markets that use different labor policies to impose that? And you mentioned a tax, using taxing systems as one way of encouraging that. Are there other ideas too that we
yeah. No, great question, Mike. I see some things that maybe I'll close on this one. Just don't want to respect people's times. Is look, I think the most important benefits to education are human and civic, above and beyond the economics. And so I'm an educator, so I'll say that first. Yeah. And I will also add, if we're really going to rebuild the American dream, we have 100 million Americans in the labor force who do not have a college degree. And for the vast majority of them, given their age and life situation, no judgment, but they will not have a college degree. So I think when we focus on the young, the returns to at least a 2-year associate's degree have long been quite high relative to a high school degree. So helping more young adults start to build even a little bit more education beyond a high school degree, I think would be great. That's why the second rung that Ken and I talked about. And the third is just to build skills to really have lifelong learning be more meaningful for all Americans. That's the logic behind the third rung that Ken and I proposed of this every decade tax credit. And part of the logic of that is small businesses in the Upper Valley, globally connected businesses in the Upper Valley, like Hypertherm and others, and Adamab, to the largest global multinationals. There's so much knowledge inside those organizations about what their workers might need and what the companies need. Let there be a lot of ways through these tax credits to figure out what is the skills development. I mean, I think a lot of people love the idea of worker training. If you look in the US and other countries, the evidence is really kind of mixed. It's hard. There's no kind of magic way we figured out to develop human capital in an ongoing way for all kinds of workers. So unleashing the market's far from perfect, but unleashing to empower lots of workers and their companies that they work for to figure out ways to build their skills all along the way as they move through their years would be great, we think. So we can get there as a country. We just got to find the right way to do it. So
okay, you've convinced me. I'm a Tigger now too, Matt. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for agreeing to be a speaker in our series. Let me add that the next and final speaker in our series is Sarah Kobalenski, my predecessor as executive director of the Haven for 9 years and currently a consultant on issues of child development and poverty. The title of her talk is Finding Hope and Discovering Possibility, the Haven as Ever Steady and Ever Changing. So please join us on January 12th at noon. Registration information can be found on our website. And thank you for attending, and we'll see you in January, I hope. Thanks again, Matt.
No worries. Thank you, Michael. Thanks, everybody. Keep well. Thanks to the Haven.